In the era of the Wild West, cowboys and other pioneers sustained themselves with straightforward, nourishing, and durable provisions. The food, prepared around campfires and in chuckwagons, was vital for their survival during lengthy cattle drives, in remote mining camps, and throughout countless days traversing the trails. So, let's explore the meals that powered the American frontier. When considering cowboy cuisine, one particular dish immediately comes to mind: cowboy beans. This wasn't merely a meal, it was the quintessential frontier dish, forming the cornerstone of trailside cooking, and every chuckwagon cook mastered its preparation. Cowboy beans were incredibly simple, yet absolutely essential. They consisted of dried pinto beans, softened by soaking overnight, then gently simmered for hours over a campfire. Their distinctiveness arose from the additional components. Salt pork provided richness and taste. Onions, if available, were included. Perhaps a touch of molasses or brown sugar offered sweetness, and a sprinkle of chili powder or dried peppers delivered heat. The beauty of cowboy beans lay in their adaptability. They could be cooked in a Dutch oven buried in hot coals, in a pot suspended over an open flame, or within the chuckwagon's integrated bean pot. They would stew all day as the cowboys worked, permeating the camp with an aroma that signaled dinner was approaching. A trail cook's journal from 1878 outlines his bean recipe. 2 pounds of beans, half a pound of salt pork, 1 onion chopped fine, a handful of brown sugar, and whatever peppers the boys can handle. Cook until the beans are soft enough to mash with a fork. As they cooked, the beans would thicken and the pork fat would meld with the bean starches, resulting in a rich, hearty dish that was profoundly satisfying. Cowboys could consume beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner without complaint, as beans guaranteed they wouldn't go hungry. The quantities were substantial. A chuckwagon cook feeding a crew of 12 cowboys would prepare at least 5 pounds of dried beans daily, equivalent to over 15 pounds of cooked beans, and every bit would be devoured. Some cooks gained legendary status for their beans. A cattle drive memoir from 1883 mentions a cook known as Bean Belly Johnson, whose beans were so exceptional that cowboys would enlist for drives solely to partake in his cooking. His secret? He incorporated bacon drippings, coffee grounds, and a splash of whiskey into each pot. Alongside these beans, sourdough biscuits were a common sight. These were not the light, buttery biscuits found in contemporary restaurants, but rather dense, chewy, and substantial. This characteristic was necessary, as they frequently represented the only bread cowboys consumed for months. Sourdough biscuits originated from a sourdough starter, that invaluable blend of flour, water, and wild yeast, which every chuckwagon cook safeguarded diligently. Losing your starter meant enduring weeks without proper bread. The evening before baking, the cook would combine flour, sourdough starter, a bit of lard or bacon grease, salt, and perhaps some baking soda into a firm dough. This mixture would then rise overnight near the fire. In the morning, he would roll out the dough, cut it into rounds, and bake them in a Dutch oven. The Dutch oven was placed directly into the coals, with additional coals stacked on the lid, creating an impromptu oven. A chuckwagon cook's manual from 1880 provides precise instructions. Place 12 coals beneath the Dutch oven and 18 coals atop the lid. Bake for 15 to 20 minutes until the biscuits are golden brown. The outcome was a biscuit with a crisp exterior and a dense, tangy interior. These biscuits were resilient enough to be carried in saddlebags for days. Cowboys would consume them fresh with butter and molasses, if available, or days later, softened by dipping them into coffee. The sourdough's characteristic tang was both distinctive and captivating, largely due to the wild yeast and bacteria in the starter, which varied by region. Some starters were decades old, handed down from one cook to another. While beans and biscuits were daily fare, one particular dish distinguished the seasoned pioneers from the novices: son-of-a-gun stew, also referred to by a more explicit name, though the polite designation was used in genteel company. This stew was concocted from the internal organs of a freshly butchered calf, specifically the heart, liver, kidneys, brains, tongue, and the prized ingredient, marrow gut, which is the tube connecting a calf's two stomachs. When a calf was slaughtered on the trail, no part was wasted. The organs were cooked immediately due to their rapid perishability. Son-of-a-gun stew provided the solution. The cook would finely chop all the organs and add them to a pot containing water, salt, and any available vegetables. The stew would simmer for hours until everything became tender. A cowboy's memoir from 1885 recounts his initial experience. "It looked like nothing I'd want to eat, a brown mess of unidentifiable chunks, but the smell was rich and meaty, and after a long day's ride, I was hungry enough to try anything. It was the best stew I'd ever tasted. The marrow gut was crucial. It imparted a richness that elevated the entire stew. Without marrow gut, it was merely organ stew. With it, it became son-of-a-gun. Not everyone could stomach it. Newcomers often refused to eat it once they learned its contents, but experienced cowboys recognized son-of-a-gun stew as a delicacy. Beyond beans and stew, cowboys required portable protein for their journeys. This is where beef jerky came into play. This was not the premium jerky available today, but rather survival food. Making jerky was straightforward. Take lean beef, slice it thinly against the grain, season it heavily with salt, and dry it in the sun or over smoke. The salt preserved the meat, and drying removed the moisture essential for bacterial growth. A ranch hand's diary from 1876 describes the process. "We butchered a steer and cut the lean meat into strips about a 1/4 inch thick. We rubbed each strip with coarse salt, then hung the strips on racks in the sun. After 3 days, the meat was hard as leather and would keep for months. The result was tough, salty, and demanded considerable chewing, but it was pure protein that remained unspoiled. Cowboys carried jerky in their saddlebags and gnawed on it throughout the day. Some jerky was smoked rather than sun-dried, which enhanced flavor and further aided preservation. Jerky could be eaten as is or rehydrated in stews. Adding a handful of jerky to a pot of beans infused it with a meaty taste and added protein. While jerky provided portable protein, salt pork served as the daily protein source. Almost every meal incorporated salt pork in some manner. Fried for breakfast, added to beans for dinner, or rendered for its fat to cook other foods, salt pork was essentially pork belly cured in heavy salt to preserve it. It could last for months without refrigeration. To prepare salt pork, one would slice off the desired amount and fry it in a pan. The salt content was extreme. Some cooks would soak the salt pork in water before cooking to reduce the salinity, while others prepared it as is. Fried salt pork served as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was monotonous but dependable, and the fat it provided was essential for sustaining energy. When fresh beef was available, typically after a steer was butchered, beef stew was a welcome change. This was a simple, wholesome meal that maximized the fresh meat. Beef stew began with chunks of beef, usually tougher cuts that benefited from prolonged, slow cooking. The meat would be browned in a Dutch oven, then covered with water. Onions, potatoes, carrots, or any available vegetables would be added. The stew would simmer for hours until the meat was incredibly tender and the vegetables had softened and thickened the liquid. A cattle drive cook's recipe from 1877 is remarkably simple. Cut beef into chunks, brown in hot fat. Add water to cover. Add whatever vegetables you have. Salt generously. Cook until the meat is tender. The beauty of beef stew was its versatility. Wild onions foraged along the trail, dried beans, whatever was on hand, could be added to the pot. Fresh beef stew was a luxury on the trail. Most of the time, cattle were too valuable to butcher for food. But occasionally, a steer would be injured and require slaughter, leading to a feast for the crew. When cowboys encountered buffalo, buffalo stew was a special treat. Buffalo meat was leaner than beef, but possessed a rich, slightly sweet flavor that many preferred. Buffalo stew was prepared in the same way as beef stew. Chunks of buffalo meat were browned and simmered with vegetables until tender. The primary difference was buffalo's leanness, necessitating more added fat. A hunter's account from 1873 describes buffalo stew. We shot a young buffalo cow and butchered her on the spot. That night, our cook made a stew with the meat, some wild onions, and the last of our potatoes. It was the finest meal we'd had in months. Buffalo hunting declined rapidly in the 1870s and 1880s as the herds were decimated. By the late 1880s, buffalo stew had become a rare delicacy, then a mere memory. Alongside beans and stew, bread was indispensable. Cornbread, being more affordable and easier to make than wheat bread, became a frontier staple. It only required cornmeal, water, salt, and some fat. The basic recipe was straightforward. Mix cornmeal with water and salt to form a thick batter. Add some melted lard or bacon grease. Pour into a hot, greased pan and bake until golden brown. A homesteader's cookbook from 1880 provides the proportions. 2 cups cornmeal, 1 cup water, 1 teaspoon salt, 2 tablespoons melted lard. Mix well and bake in a hot oven until a knife inserted comes out clean. Cornbread could be baked in a Dutch oven, over a campfire, in a wood-fired oven, or in a skillet on the stovetop. It was versatile and forgiving. Its texture was grainy and crumbly. Frontier cornbread was dense and substantial, satisfying hunger and providing energy for arduous work. Cornbread accompanied every meal, with beans for dinner, with molasses for breakfast, or crumbled into milk for a quick bite. For breakfast, flapjacks were a favorite when the cook had enough time to prepare them. These were straightforward pancakes made from sourdough starter, flour, and water, devoid of eggs, milk, or any elaborate ingredients. The cook would blend sourdough starter with flour and water to produce a pourable batter, perhaps adding a touch of salt and, if available, some sugar. This batter would then be spooned onto a hot, oiled griddle and cooked until bubbles appeared, at which point it was flipped. A chuckwagon cook's journal from 1882 details his flapjack preparation. I prepare the batter the evening before and leave it by the fire. In the morning, I heat my griddle, grease it with rendered salt pork fat, and cook the flapjacks. Each man receives 4 or 5, consumed with molasses. Flapjacks were substantial and provided cowboys with the necessary energy for their morning tasks. The sourdough imparted a distinct tang, setting them apart from ordinary pancakes. Crafting perfect flapjacks demanded skill. The griddle's temperature needed to be just right. A proficient cook could swiftly produce dozens of immaculate flapjacks. Cowboys would devour flapjacks as quickly as the cook could make them, with a hungry crew consuming 50 to 60 flapjacks at a single breakfast. Another popular breakfast item was biscuits and gravy, a comforting dish that sustained one through a long morning of work. The biscuits were the same sourdough kind served with other meals. The gravy, however, was where the culinary artistry lay. Gravy began with the fat and drippings rendered from fried salt pork or bacon. After the meat was cooked, the cook would retain the fat in the pan and incorporate flour, stirring continuously to form a roux. Once the flour was cooked, he would add milk, if accessible, or water, stirring until the gravy achieved a thick consistency. The outcome was a rich, creamy gravy adorned with pork bits and imbued with a savory, salty taste. This would be generously spooned over split biscuits. A cowboy's letter from 1879 recounts the appeal of biscuits and gravy. Following a chilly night on watch, there's nothing more satisfying than hot biscuits submerged in thick gravy. It offers internal warmth and fills your stomach for the day ahead. Biscuits and gravy was a hearty, filling meal, supplying the calories and fat essential for cowboys' demanding physical labor. For a swift bread selection that didn't necessitate an oven, corn dodgers were the preferred option. These were small cakes of cornmeal batter fried in hot fat. The batter simply comprised cornmeal, water, and salt mixed to a thick consistency. The cook would heat fat in a skillet until it was very hot, then drop spoonfuls of batter into the fat. The dodgers would fry until they were golden and crisp. An 1875 Frontier cookbook describes corn dodgers. Combine cornmeal with sufficient water to create a firm batter. Drop spoonfuls into hot lard. Fry until browned on both sides. Corn dodgers could be enjoyed plain with molasses or served as an accompaniment to beans and stew. They were particularly favored for breakfast due to their quick preparation time. In the American Southwest, where Mexican and American cultures converged, huevos rancheros became a staple cowboy breakfast. This uncomplicated dish featured fried eggs served on tortillas, topped with a spicy tomato sauce. The sauce was concocted from tomatoes, onions, and chili peppers, cooked together until thick. Eggs were fried and placed on warm tortillas, then finished with the sauce. An account from a vaquero in New Mexico in 1880 describes huevos rancheros. We prepare the sauce the night before, simmering tomatoes and peppers until they are tender and robust. In the morning, we warm tortillas, fry eggs in lard, and assemble the dish. Huevos rancheros required ingredients that were not always available on the trail. Fresh eggs, tomatoes, and tortillas were luxuries in remote areas. But in the Southwest, where these ingredients were more prevalent, it was a regular breakfast staple. Another Southwestern influence was fried beans, also known as refried beans. Leftover beans from dinner would be mashed and fried in lard until they formed a thick, creamy paste. The process was straightforward. Take cold, cooked beans and mash them. Heat lard in a skillet and add the mashed beans. Fry, stirring constantly, until the beans are hot and have absorbed the fat. A ranch cook's notes from Texas in 1877 mention preparing fried beans every morning. The beans remaining from last night's dinner are never wasted. I mash them and fry them in a generous amount of lard. The men eat them with eggs and tortillas. Fried beans exemplified frontier resourcefulness. Nothing was squandered. Leftover beans were transformed into a new dish with the addition of fat. After weeks of consuming beans, salt pork, and biscuits, cowboys longed for something sweet. Dried apple pie was the most prevalent dessert on the frontier, made from dried apples that could be stored for many months. Dried apples were rehydrated by soaking them in water overnight. The following day, they would be cooked with sugar and spices until soft and thick. This filling would then be encased in a pie crust and baked. The pie crust was a simple mixture of flour, lard, salt, and water, blended and rolled thinly. The crust would be placed in a Dutch oven, filled with the apple mixture, topped with another layer of crust, and baked with coals both above and below. A chuckwagon cook's recipe from 1881 outlines the procedure. Soak 1 pound of dried apples overnight. In the morning, cook them with a cup of sugar and a pinch of cinnamon until thick. Make a crust from flour and lard. Assemble the pie and bake for 30 minutes. The result was a pie that delivered an intense apple flavor. Drying the apples concentrated their sweetness and imparted a chewy texture. While not quite like fresh apple pie, after months on the trail, it was a slice of heaven. Dried apple pie was typically reserved for special events, such as Sundays, holidays, or the conclusion of a successful cattle drive. It was a treat that evoked memories of home for the cowboys. Finally, no discussion of frontier cuisine is complete without mention of cowboy coffee. This was not a meticulously measured and precisely brewed beverage. It was raw, potent, and prepared in vast quantities. The method was strikingly simple. Boil water in a large pot. Add ground coffee, approximately a handful per gallon of water. Allow it to boil for a few minutes, then remove from the heat. Introduce a cup of cold water to settle the grounds. Pour and consume. The result was coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, as cowboys would quip. It was bitter, thick, and packed with caffeine. A trail cook's notes from 1878 describe his coffee routine. I prepare coffee first thing every morning in my largest pot. The men drink it with breakfast, fill their canteens with it for the day, and consume more with dinner. I go through 5 pounds of coffee per week for 12 men. The coffee was often reheated multiple times throughout the day. By evening, it was as thick as syrup and as bitter as medicine. Yet cowboys drank it nonetheless. Some cooks would add eggshells to the coffee to aid in settling the grounds and mitigating bitterness, while others added a pinch of salt. These tricks were passed down from one cook to another. Cowboy coffee was more than just a drink. It was a ritual, a comfort, and a fundamental necessity. It commenced the day, accompanied every meal, and provided warmth on cold nights. These 15 recipes were not elaborate, but they sustained the inhabitants of the West. From cowboy beans to sourdough biscuits, from son-of-a-gun stew to dried apple pie, these simple dishes energized the cowboys, miners, and settlers who forged America.